Good afternoon. In today's session, we're going to take a look at the Victorian age. We'll start off by outlining the historical aspects of the age. We'll then go on to briefly touch upon the social and the cultural aspects. And we'll end by seeing how these impacted the literary aspects of the age. So, taking a look at what we understand as the Victorian age. English literature in the 19th century is easily divisible into two unequal parts of unequal duration. The first is 1798 to 1832, which is the Romantic Revival. 1832 roughly onwards till the end, or 1901, we call it the Victorian literature. Now, it's a pretty long age, so to speak. And the Victorian period was from the first half of the age of reform in England. The age itself was very long, and it coincided with Queen Victoria's accession to the throne in 1837 till her death in 1901, which is a pretty long age, almost 64 years. And in fact, it is one of the longest time that any monarch in English history has ever served. Usually this period is taken up by 3 or 4 monarchs at times. But in the case of Queen Victoria, it was just her. Now, this was an age that was full of turbulence, change, upheavals of sorts. On the one hand, we had extreme advancement. Okay? To give you an example, the Industrial Revolution began in England in 1769-70 with the invention of the spinning jenny and the steam power. By the time of the Victorian era, the technological revolution was well underway. And during these years, the changes were incredible, so to speak. And Victoria, Queen Victoria, was born into a world when people traveled by horse and carriage and lit their homes with candles. By the time she died, there were trains and electricity. So you can see the fast pace of the change right from this example. Faster steamships, telegraphs and telephones, medical antiseptics, photography. Industrial growth was changing the nature of human life. Okay? No other age, I would think, had seen so much of change. Of course, all this expansion and change comes with a little price. I will discuss the negative aspects a little later. The British imperialism, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Very famous quotation. To get an idea of this expansion, the geographical area of the English Empire took up almost 1/10 of the entire globe. Controlling so much of the globe was supposed to have been an administrative nightmare, but Queen Victoria managed it. India was one of their major colonies. English missionary societies sent missionaries to their colonies. Along with all this, what we see was a Britain transformed. I'll take a little bit to explain about this transformation. From the 1830s to the 1870s, Britain underwent changes that transformed the lives of its people. All of a sudden, there was this total transformation in the lives of the people. The British manufacturing became dominant in the world, and trade and the financial sector also grew significantly. The rail network, which began in the 1830s, was largely completed by the 1870s and had a great effect not only on the accessibility of travel and speed of movement, but also on the appearance of the countryside. British power and influence overseas expanded and seemed to become permanent for a change. The population grew enormously from around 12 million in 1812 to 25 million by 1870. The period also saw a significant shift of population. There was a migration from the countryside to the towns, and which led to the growth of large cities. It was an age of optimism. Where do we see the optimism? The Victorian age, as was already mentioned, was a turbulent period in many ways. It did not have any wars within the country, but Victorian England certainly went to wars outside. It saw itself as a time of confident progress. Many people believed that England was leading the world into a new and better age, which was true. There were more enlightened laws, and the benefits of wealth created was through the industrial development. There was greater political stability within the country than the rest of Europe, meaning what Queen Victoria said was followed by anyone. There was no unrest. There was deference to law, to the class and authority. There was respect for the law, and the conviction that work is a duty which was good for the soul was believed by many. The social concerns that took place were, well, like with any age, and especially with the Victorian age, not everything was very positive all the time. There was a lot of negativity. The negative aspects were the daily needs and problems of ordinary people remained. Poverty, poor housing, ill health, a horrifying level of child mortality, hunger, long hours of grinding labor, all this was there. So the rapid changes that took place benefited some people long before others. The social focus of many Victorian novels, if we talk about the literature, the novel came to be the predominant genre. And these novels posed key moral and social questions about issues. Some of the issues were the need for schooling, the care of orphans and other deprived children, cruelty to children, and corruption of children by criminals. Most of the novels, we'll see Dickens mainly. He pointed out a number of these social ills. And we also mentioned that it was an age of reform. So some reforms were taking place, taking up some of these issues that were highlighted in the novels. And the problems that was created by this emphasis on social class and the newly acquired wealth. Well, conflict between employers and workers created by this rapid industrialization and urbanization. These things remained. So, what we notice about this age was the British Empire during the reign of Queen Victoria reached dimensions unheard and undreamt of in the entire history of mankind. The sudden expansion, it had certain immediate and visible consequences, and some which were neither immediate, not as easily perceptible. As the 19th century progressed, the social conditions began to change and improve. Not, however, without some extremely undesirable consequences. The sudden taste and feel of affluence engendered by the colonial economy, it raised the expectations of the common man. The desire for comfort and luxury was no longer confined to the upper class. The Industrial Revolution gradually destroyed the old agricultural England, leading to migration, as we talked about. The countryside now was becoming depopulated. Industrialization, it managed to shake the supremacy of the aristocratic class and the landed gentry. The common man's dream of wealth, affluence, and luxury, it brought into being a new merchant class. And this new class clamored for power and prestige, and did not, oftentimes, agree to the accepted order of things. So there was a disparity. The real resources available and the demands being made on these resources. This was hopelessly out of proportion. So Victorian traditions and Victorian conventions were thus being subjected to greater and greater pressures and large cracks or tears began to appear in the Victorian fabric. The age was one of social and political reforms. It was right at the beginning of the age, in 1832, that the first Reform Act, the first Reform Bill, was passed, which granted the vote to almost all male members of middle class. Then we had the Factory Act, which started regulating child labor in factories. Then the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834 established a system of warehouses for the poor people. 1867 saw the Second Reform Act, which gave the vote to skilled working men. 1871 saw the legalization of the trade unions with the Trade Union Act. 1884, the Third Reform Act granted the right to vote to all male householders. But the women's question remained the same. In fact, women's suffrage did not happen until 1918. The positive aspects of the age we have already discussed earlier. The negative aspects: pollution, overcrowding due to factory activities, lack of hygienic conditions, houses overcrowded, most people living in miserable conditions, poor houses, shared water supplies, the great stink of 1858, epidemics, cholera, typhoid, causing a high mortality in towns. And these all came to a peak in the great stink of 1858. Exhalations from the decaying matter poisoned the air. Alongside the Victorian compromise, they were great moralizers. They supported personal duty, hard work, decorum, respectability, chastity. All these were laid down by the way Queen Victoria herself conducted herself. The Victorian synonym for prude stood for extreme repression. Even the furniture legs had to be concealed under heavy cloth, not to be suggestive. New ideas were discussed and debated by a large part of the society. The middle class was obsessed with gentility, respectability, and decorum. And respectability distinguished the middle from the lower class. Decorum, which was given a lot of weightage, it meant that Victorian private lives were dominated by an authoritarian father. Women were subjected to male authority. They were expected to marry and make home a refuge for their husbands. Key thinkers of that time, they based their ideas on the times and the way life was lived. We had John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, Darwin. All this led the way or paved the way for the rise of the novel as a literary genre. There was a communion of interests and opinions between writers and their readers of the time. The Victorians themselves were avid consumers of literature. They borrowed books from circulating libraries and read various periodicals. The novel initially made its first appearance in installments on the pages of periodicals. Many of the famous writers used to write in this way. The voice of the omniscient narrator provided a comment on the plot and erected a rigid barrier between right and wrong, light and darkness. The setting chosen by most Victorian novelists was invariably the town. Victorian writers concentrated on the creation of characters and achieved a deeper analysis of their inner life. Poetry, we'll see Lord Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, who made his poems a vehicle for a deep psychological study, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and others. But before we end, I'd like to just talk a little bit about how this age impacted literature. Literature, more specifically, the novel. So you see, the age was now set for the importance for the rise of the novel. And it saw itself transforming and mirroring the transformation within the period. From romanticism to realism, politics to passion, optimism to pessimism, the novel could successfully deal with the changing mood of the society. Class, gender, individualism, society, all were given space in the novel. The period was known to have witnessed a massive change, and all the change you could find in some form or the other in the novels. The Victorian era is seen as the link between the romanticism of the 18th century and the realism of the 20th century. It started off as something to entertain the rising middle classes and to depict their contemporary life in a changing society. And although the novel had been in development before that, since the 18th century with the works of Defoe, Fielding, Sterne, Richardson, it was in the Victorian period that the novel got mass acceptance and readership. The growth of the cities, a ready domestic market, and one in the overseas colonies, and an increase in printing and publishing houses, all these facilitated the growth of the novel as a form. The year 1870, an Education Act was passed, which made education an easy access to the masses, further increasing literacy rates among the population. Certain jobs required a certain level of reading ability, and simple novels catered to this by becoming a device to practice reading. Also, the time of the daily commute to work for men and women and the time alone at home for women could be filled by reading, which now became a leisure activity. So as a response to the latter, the demand for fiction rose substantially. And the novels of the age had a moral strain in them, with a belief in the innate goodness of human nature. The characters were well-rounded, and the protagonist usually belonged to a middle-class society who struggled to create a niche for himself in the industrial and mercantile world. The stress was in realism, and an attempt to describe the daily struggles of ordinary men that the middle-class reader could associate with. The moral tangents were perhaps an attempt to rescue the moral degradation prevalent in the society then and supply the audience with hope and positivity. These moral angles allowed for inclusion of larger debates in fiction, like the one surrounding the woman question, marriage, progress, education, the Industrial Revolution. New roles for women were created because of the resultant economic market, and novels became the means where the domestic confinement of women were questioned. Novels reflecting the larger questions surrounding women, like those of their roles and duties. In the latter half of the century, the Married Women's Property Act was passed. The women's suffrage became an important point of debate, and poverty and other economic reasons challenged the traditional ones. Traditional roles of women. The novel as a form became the medium where such concerns were raised. So, if we look at it, this age contained within itself heights of positivity and the lows of negativity. Okay? So, it was in The Tale of Two Cities where Charles Dickens, that famous beginning, where he said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. And he goes on. He says, we were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. So you see, it was an age of contradictions. And within these contradictions was set or paved the way for the 20th century to happen. So one would think that the Victorian age bridged the 18th century and the 20th century. So we will find a lot of influences in the writings from the 18th to the early 19th in their writings, and definitely the Victorian age looks forward to the 20th century of the time with the realistic aspect in bringing the realistic aspect in literature from all angles. Thank you.